Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and hello everybody. My name is Amir and today I would like to talk about some cracks that are appearing in New Europe. We have seen over the past few years support for Ukraine's war effort decrease in the West. For instance, Alexander Mercurius explains that the UK has reduced its transfers to Ukraine from $5 billion per year to between 3 and 4 pounds, from £5 billion per year to between 3 and 4 billion pounds per year. And the UK's mainstream media does not mention this. At the same time, Poland has lambasted Ukraine for reburying Ukrainian Third Reich supporters. These are people that the Poles remember for committing a genocide against them. President Volodymyr Zelensky even renamed some military units after these very collaborators. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk instructed the Polish NATO delegation in Ankara to make no funding commitments to Ukraine in retaliation. Alexander Mercurius has also heard that similar doubts exist in Italy too, and he agrees that Ukraine will get its money regardless. He explains that President Donald John continues to complain about how NATO does not intervene directly in the Persian Gulf. President Volodymyr Zelensky will have to go to great lengths to get his money from both the US and the EU. At the same time, we have seen Russian strikes throughout Kiev, and Larry Johnson explains that these strikes have reportedly killed some NATO officers. NATO is currently debating how to proceed. Meanwhile, there was the NATO summit, as I have mentioned before, in Ankara. A summit that Pepe Escobar explains was aimed at funding a Ukrainian drone campaign. This campaign would have been much like the one we have seen over the past couple of months. The same campaign that has now resulted in Kiev's devastation. Russia has overcome all Western attempts at supporting Ukraine throughout the SMO, and President Vladimir Putin came out recently stating that Russia's objective is the liberation of Novorossiya. This is a territory that includes everything south and east of Kiev. And as the US imposes a 5% of national GDP on defense for all NATO members, it tries to stay at arm's length from the SMO. How long it will stay out of the SMO is something of an open question. In many aspects, it will not stay out, and it will continue to provide assistance, including the critical intelligence support needed for many of these Western weapons to operate as a harmonious whole. And as if the troubles that Ukraine was facing were not enough, Larry Johnson explained recently that Senator Lindsey Graham was killed in a Russian strike while visiting a drone factory in Kiev. This is a significant blow to both the Zionists and the neoconservatives within the US. In fact, one of President Donald's interviews recently stated how he relied on Senator Lindsey for his support in getting the Democrats on his side. Without such cross-party cooperation, President Donald's chances in the upcoming midterms are going to be quite severely hampered indeed. But there is other news as well, as there was a very important call between President Vladimir and President Donald on the 4th of July. This was a call that started at that started at 23:55 Moscow time, and it lasted for 85 minutes. According to the assistant to the president of Russia for foreign policy, Yuri Ushakov, the discussion started out cordial with appreciations and respect exchanged by both countries for each other's roles in pivotal moments in history, such as the American War of Independence, the American Civil War, and World War II. The meeting then became businesslike and was candid and constructive. These are carefully chosen words whose vagueness was needed to mask some of the tensions. Alexander Mercurius argues that this was more of a disagreement than an out-and-out row. The two leaders spoke on a settlement on Ukraine, given that the US will be at the NATO summit in Ankara. President Vladimir hoped that the US could encourage its allies to cease all hostilities and begin the search for more peaceful solutions. The West must remove itself from supporting Ukraine's drone attacks on civilians, and Konstantinovka's recent liberation shows that Ukraine does not have the initiative. Lastly, the readout explicitly states that Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner may only return to Moscow at Russia's convenience. This is a polite way of saying that their efforts were appreciated but are no longer so. It should be remembered that neither of these two are in fact diplomats. They never even served public office. The only reason they are in such positions is because of their personal relationship with President Donald, with Jared Kushner being his son-in-law. Patronage at its finest, in other words. President Donald explained that US-Russia economic prospects will not happen without a settlement in Ukraine. This, Alexander stresses, confirms that US economic cooperation is a bribe designed to end the SMO, bribes that Russia rejected. President Vladimir expressed his hopes that the MoU-based negotiations between the US and Iran will find a mutually beneficial solution. Russia stands ready to provide practical assistance in de-escalation. President Donald thanked Russia for its balanced stance and constructive approach. President Vladimir reminded President Donald that he still has an outstanding visit to visit Moscow. This was something that was discussed in Anchorage in 2025. The reminder was meant to soothe tensions, but Alexander considers this call overall quite contentious. Contrast this with their last conversation on June 12th, Russia Day, which was much warmer. The initiator of this call is not mentioned, but Alexander suspects that President Donald initiated the call after President Vladimir's written message to Americans, congratulating them on their 250th birthday. And I agree with this statement because, as Alexander goes on, President Vladimir is very timely when it comes to anniversaries, so such a call is typical of him. And I can speak with personal experience as well. So the call itself is not out of the ordinary. What is out of the ordinary was perhaps President Donald's unwitting admission that US attempts at economic cooperation with Russia were merely a ploy, and that the US was not ever going to consider truly integrating itself economically with Russia. There were many who stated this. Many were warning that the meeting in Anchorage would come to nothing. There were even some who warned that President Vladimir might be assassinated there. Fortunately, that did not happen. But what did happen was something everybody feared but hoped would not come to pass. The US was merely being cynical, and there would be no economic integration. Integration which, at a time when the US is running low on energy and would need as much access to cheap materials as possible, would be very beneficial in the currently ailing US economy and, of course, the oil depression. That leaves me that leaves us with the MoU itself. A few days ago, Pepe Escobar stated, or rather last week, Pepe Escobar explained that the MoU would have been revived after the funeral on July the 9th, and indirect talks may resume in Islamabad. Iran expressed its confidence in Pakistan's ability to guarantee the delegation's security there, and this comes after Pakistani intelligence repeatedly discovered Israeli plots to assassinate both Iranian and Pakistani delegations. And there was one intercepted plot to assassinate Grand Ayatollah Mujtaba during his dad's funeral. Larry Johnson explains that the funeral itself is unprecedented in the histories of both the 20th and 21st centuries. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the largest funeral was that of Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1989. Grand Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's funeral greatly exceeds the previous record in terms of both attendance of world leaders and the number of mourners. He does not think that the West appreciates this moment. This is a formative memory that will guide the Iranian people and build up social cohesion. He explains, but back to the MoU. He explains that despite US violations of the MoU, Iran is now selling more oil per day than it did before the second imposed war, at a 20 to 40% premium. This was before the sanctions were reimposed, of course. And cargo ships were bringing vital goods into Iran. Throughout the MoU, the US never released any of Iran's assets, and now that sanctions have been reimposed, the MoU is effectively dead, or perhaps on life support at the best. The US is still experiencing a severe shortage of diesel and aviation fuel as its strategic reserves run dry. Any direct or indirect talks would have been very much a sign of optimism. But there were no delegations that went to Islamabad. But this is bad news for not only the MoU, but it also means that the US economy will continue to suffer. Given all of these, he concludes that the MoU itself ended up being a mixed bag. And I tend to agree with it. Although the MoU had its good points, they were simply too sparse. And so far, neither Qatar nor Saudi Arabia have actually sent over the money, the 12 billion that they had promised. And we are not sure if they would send over the other 12 billion. So we will have to wait and see if their promises were ever sincere. Meanwhile, Pepe Escobar spoke of how the funeral was instrumental in Iran's social cohesion. In Tehran alone, 10 to 20 million mourners came to pay their respects. Similar scenes played out in Qom, which is a small city of 1.2 million people. The airplane carrying Grand Ayatollah Ali's body went to Karbala and Najaf as well, and it was met with similar receptions before arriving at Mashhad, where the body was finally interred. Such cohesion is hard to imagine in the modern era, not just in terms of numbers, but in the faith and drive of the mourners. They honor not only Grand Ayatollah Ali's life, but the passing of the baton to his son. Iran's international relationships have also been strengthened during this event, thus making it a rising power, one that does not want to dominate the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia already understands that Southwest Asia has changed and that it will need to accommodate Iran. Pakistan has established itself as a diplomatic power against all odds. The US has to leave Southwest Asia. Its only foothold in the region is Israel, which is why Lebanon is so important. President Donald John's statements thanking Turkey for its efforts during the second imposed war is him seducing Turkey into remaining dependent on NATO. Of course, Turkey will hedge. It will look for opportunities, but will be forced to choose. And no one knows what Turkey will choose, not even the Turks themselves. Pepe confirms that whilst the current Syrian government is a Turkish creation, it is unknown where its loyalties truly lie. It is not even clear if Syria aims to invade Lebanon. If the US intervenes in Lebanon, then the MoU dies. And in many ways, this has already happened, as the US has not stopped Israel from continuing its ongoing massacres in Lebanon. There has been no withdrawal despite the massive casualties Israel continues to face at the hands of Hezbollah. And back to the SMO, no, back on the MOU, there is also the issue of the GCC. Larry explains that the GCC, in his opinion, is an irrational actor that is engaged in self-sabotage. They paid the price when they allowed their tankers to violate the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the PGSA's protocols when they penetrated the Strait of Hormuz. It should be remembered that Iran has complete control of the Strait of Hormuz, and who enters and goes through it was explicitly concluded in the MOU as being Iran's responsibility. Excuse me. These tankers traveled with with their transponders off, and they traveled using unauthorized routes that were near the Omani coast. All of this was merely a pretext for the US to reinitiate its bombing. And as for and as for Iran's transition of power, Pepe Escobar states that this new government, Grand Ayatollah Mujtaba's government, starts effectively on July the 11th, as he will be guiding Iran publicly as a kind of heir apparent. Of course, for security reasons, he will be staying far he will be staying far in the background. Communications will of course be an analog as well. His inner circle his inner circle contains Pepe's source, and this source repeatedly confirmed that Field Marshal Asim Munir of Pakistan was informed that if Iran experiences another strike, it could trigger Iran's formal withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If Iran does so, it will have to invoke Article 10 of the NNPT. Invocation of Article 10 triggers a 90-day notice, after which Iran formally withdraws. Then, the source claimed that, quote, all bets are off, end quote. If this happens, it will be the beginning of a new era without the MoU, under wartime conditions and with massive popular pressure for vengeance. Abandoning the NNPT does go against Grand Ayatollah Ali's fatwa, but that fatwa can be overturned. And the withdrawal of the NNPT does not have to be the only move. As we have seen already, US stocks in oil and oil products are decreasing significantly, and the US will likely arrive at a crisis point by mid-August. But before that, the US had bombed southern Iran from Khorramshahr to Chabahar. To the 40 to 45 million mourners who were out to pay their respects for Grand Ayatollah Ali, this bombing was much like Pearl Harbor. As Larry explains, it was an event that changed American policy in all areas, not just domestic, but diplomatic, economic, and wartime policies. This is happening to Iran as we speak. The targets were civilian infrastructure and key transit corridors that connect Iran to the rest of BRICS. This included the Iran-China rail line, right, that uses Mashhad as a hub, and of course Chabahar port. Pepe explains that the US is bombing Eurasian integration, including with its so-called ally India. President Donald is now going against the very off-ramp he needed to keep the US economy from going nuclear and thus staying in power. The MoU to him is dead, and Iran does not care because they always saw it as an Iranian ploy to gain time. And yet, despite these actions, President Donald is begging Pakistan to bring Iran back to the MoU, something that was confirmed by an Iranian source close to Grand Ayatollah Mujtaba. Pakistan continues to try to keep the MoU on track, even though they know that the US is not playing ball. This effectively gives Iran the initiative. He asserts that it cannot trust Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but this will all be debated in Tehran. And as for And as for Oman, which was one of the countries whose ships was there, he explains that for all practical purposes, Oman is with Iran, so there is no chance of a betrayal. Their small stature, however, means that it cannot afford to antagonize the US openly. Therefore, the Omani tanker that violated the PGSA's guidelines will be investigated at the highest levels between both governments. And as for Iran's decisions, there are some Iranian analysts who question the scale of Iran's retaliation. They debate whether to go all out or to maintain a strategic patience that will last until the US's strategic fuel reserves are finally depleted by mid August. Every decision has pros and cons. And one decision I already talked about was the withdrawal from the NNPT. This, of course, implies a revision of Iran's nuclear doctrine, something that will definitely receive massive Iranian public support. He confirms that the US does not understand any of these decisions and that it did not even read the MoU. It also means that all deliberations within Iran's Supreme National Security Council on the MoU, which had the highest authority on this portfolio, courtesy of Grand Ayatollah Mojtaba's delegation to it, were for naught. This, of course, means that any Iranian politicians and statesmen who sought any kind of working relationship with the US can no longer claim to have covered any ground, let alone any victories. The Supreme National Security Council itself did not have many such liberals in the first place, with the only one of significance I know of, for instance, is President Masoud Pezeshkian himself. And meanwhile, internationally, there have been other developments that concern the MoU. President Mohammad Marandi explains that last week, an Iranian airliner breached the Royal Saudi Air Force's blockade over Yemen. This is the first time in 10 years that the blockade was broken. This came after a high-profile Saudi delegation visited Iran to pay their respects to the martyred Grand Ayatollah Ali. Saudi Arabia is also placing pressure on Yemen itself due to Saudi court politics. He himself blames President Mohammed bin Salman for launching the Yemeni civil war in the first place. And just recently, Professor Nima Al-Khorshid reported that another Iranian airliner took off for Yemen, but before it could land, the Royal Saudi Air Force bombed Sana'a International Airport. A spokesperson for Ansarullah declared that this airstrike ends the de-escalation phase between the two countries. It unveils Saudi aggression towards Yemen and that Yemen will retaliate. Colonel Jacques Boad believes that Saudi Arabia tries to act as a neutral with Iran. Its presence at Grand Ayatollah Ali's funeral and foregoing retaliation when Iran attacked US bases in Saudi Arabia point to its maturity. Previously, Saudi Arabia protested protested against the US's arrival during the Gulf War, but they do not want to antagonize the US. And as I have stated before, they will not for both economic and more so political reasons ever drop the petrodollar in favor of the petro yuan fully. They may try to carve out their own niche, but it will be within US but it will be within the US's but it will be within the US's power to tolerate, however dispassionately. As for Yemen, Saudi Arabia has a particular obsession with Yemen to the point of imposing a government on it. This government itself was toppled in a popular revolution led by Ansarullah in 2015, which resulted in the Yemeni civil war, a war that had come to a ceasefire just recently, and that ceasefire is over. This, of course, means that the Bab al Mandab is at serious risk of being closed down, which not only stops US naval vessels from easily transiting the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean, but it also means that Saudi shipping from its west coast is no longer free of any danger. Yemen could utilize its missiles to strike Saudi shipping and thus bar it from exporting any crude, as opposed to the paltry 3 million barrels per day that it exports now. In the meantime, I would like to speak about economic policies and how they intertwine with national and in many cases personal culture. Just recently, Alexander Mercurius did a program where he explained that the governor of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, Elvira Nebulina, is still burdening the Russian economy when she reduced the interest rate by 0.5%, making the current interest rate 14.5%, thus making the real interest rate, which is the CBRF's interest rate minus the inflation rate, a massive 10%. This forced other larger banks to lend at around 12 to 13% because they need to pay off the CBRF loans and to make a profit. Smaller banks lend at 20% or more. He explains that in January and February this year, the Russian economy contracted. March and April saw the economy rebound. It is not exactly clear why this rebound happened. Then there was a dip in May, and early figures for June suggested the economy is now expanding. Manufacturers Purchasing Managers Index, the MPMI, stood at a high 50.3%. For anyone who does not know, the MPMI is one of the most valuable key performance indicators. It shows how by how much an economy's manufacturing increases, with 50 being neutral and even 51 being a significant rise. And as for the number 50.3, this is the highest since 2025. But high interest rates in the face of falling inflation makes one wonder if such interest rates should be sustained. Russian banks are calling for a decrease in interest rates because growth is being suffocated and it could risk a recession. It is possible for the CBRF to push inflation far below its target of 4% using this policy, and this has happened before to the point of deflation. The CBRF, for its part, states that there is no risk of recession, but that inflation remains a challenge. So the interest rates will remain high. German Gref, for instance, the CEO of Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, and a part of the CBRF, is a supporter of neoliberal economic policies, and he argued that she cut interest rates further to foster economic growth. Meanwhile, Russia, the real wages of Russians are growing. Median wealth itself has grown by over 9%. Alexander believes that these factors give the CBRF solid ground to keep interest rates high. Big industries, which typically do not borrow, continue to rake in profits, which they then reinvest. But he does argue that this complacency comes at the cost of SMEs and customers who need the loans. SMEs are central to key industries such as food processing, agriculture, logistics, etc. He also explains that Governor Elvira Nabiullina has a history of maintaining high interest rates. Between 2014 and 2019, when she was still governor, she kept the real interest rate at a high 5%, which even then was seen as too much. This is because she operates on the assumption that the Russian economy is operating at full capacity. So, if she reduces interest rates on an economy at full capacity that continues to grow, it will overheat the economy and inflation spirals upwards. But if she could keep growth down using interest rates, she could keep inflation down. Capacity then increases gradually as long as investment rates are maintained, and they are being maintained within Russia, and only later will she reduce the interest rates. The problem is, of course, this is an assumption that not everyone shares, and the point where she says she can reduce interest rates significantly is always out of reach in the real world. And, and the aforementioned Sberbank is important to this argument. It is involved in retail and therefore the actual economy, which is why German Graf contends that the Russian economy has not reached full capacity at all. If the CBRF cuts rates, the Russian economy will grow without a rise in inflation. This is also sparked by her own personal experience. She did cut interest rates significantly in 2023 and 2024, something both Alexander and I remember. At the time, German Graf warned that she was cutting them too far. The result was inflation. But more importantly, it scared her from trying again. As for why this argument between growth, inflation, and interest is so important, Alexander believes that the Russian government wants to see growth, but not at the cost of inflation. And she delivers that. which is why she has kept her job despite her overcompensation and her untrue assumptions. Another reason is that she is very loyal and effective in other aspects. She cleaned up the Russian banking system, troubleshot issues in the exchange rate, and took decisive action in 2022 to stabilize the economy. President Vladimir remembers these lauded actions and remains thankful to her. He did push back on her in 2019 due to the interest rates causing the inflation rate to shrink from 4%, which was the target at the time, to 2%. And at the time, even she agreed that it was not good for the economy and began to cut those rates. Growth increased, but plans to continue this policy in 2020 were halted due to COVID and and because of sanctions during the SMO. The growth attained during that time was not consolidated either. He asserts that Alexander asserts that eventually President Vladimir will once again ask her to reduce interest rates. How how long that would take, how much pressure would have to build, we will have to wait and see. Of course, Governor Elvira Nebulina can continue to simply wait it out and make these small half% cuts every month. But eventually, there will be a call for more cuts for the sake of Russian growth. And as for China, there was a very intriguing interview where Cynthia Chung explains that China's culture is an important factor in resisting predatory and extractive systems that the West uses both within and abroad. Given that Confucianism remains the key moral compass among the Chinese, and that the Communist Party of China continues to draw upon Chinese history to guide its economics, the study of Confucianism is necessary, which explains why China's banks opt to loan out to its own citizens at relatively competitive rates, but they do so responsibly. They are also beholden to the banks, of course, are all owned by the government, and they act as public creditors, where the money truly belongs to the people, and therefore do not go about bankrupting their their borrowers and the economy as a whole. China continues to open itself up to the rest of the world as well and develops at a rapid pace. The Belt and Road Initiative continues to develop the rest of the world without the use of imperialist policies like colonialism and predatory loans. All of this would have been impossible without Chinese ethics and morality, which speak of win-win cooperation and aversion to war and striving for the betterment of all peoples, regardless of their race, color, nationality, or religious beliefs. It is something that the West does not exactly have. These ideals came about after the romance of the Three Kingdoms, after the Three Kingdoms period, a time which, although has been largely lost to history, remains ingrained as a war that had ended the Han dynasty. It had brought China to the brink of ruin as a civilization state, as multiple smaller factions vied for power. until being coalesced into the aforementioned three kingdoms. Three kingdoms that warred until only one remained. This was a time of great this was a time of great strife, where the poorest people the poorest people who previously had next to nothing had to go on surviving through their own means without any state to protect them. There has been no such event in Europe's history. The 30 Years' War, for instance, did give about a did give about the Peace of Westphalia, which does stress the importance of economic cooperation between nations, along with the commonly mentioned non-interference in domestic affairs. But as we can see, there has been no attempts to put those noble actions into words. The EU, the UK, and the US by extension, and the US continue to provoke Russia. They have been doing so since the 90s. And that is only the Russian Federation of today. They have not opted for any peace. If anything, they have cut off the very economic links that were needed to guarantee peace. And, as I had mentioned before, the US's offers of economic cooperation were merely ploys. But the economic links between China and Russia remain permanent, as do the ones between Russia and Belarus, and Russia with BRICS. Meanwhile, the West experiences economic meltdown for the very lack of morality and culture that the Chinese possess. For instance, Professor Richard Wolff explains that the West will fight Russia to break it up into smaller satellites, since it has no way to endlessly import cheap labor, it has no colonies, and it cannot endlessly take on exorbitant debts. The West is simply uncompetitive in a world dominated by free trade. Meanwhile, Russia's powerful yet flexible government allows economic surplus to be reasonably allocated for the sake of national development and not for the profits of monopolies. Russia still has a vast Far East that needs to be developed, and the SMO itself acts as an economic stimulus. He explains that the US is holding technological advancement back whenever it halts international competition within the US. For instance, it recently banned BYD new energy vehicles, which are some of the best in the world in terms of quality and price, from entering the US. This deprives the US of the most advanced vehicles ever produced, thus stunting the pace of breakthroughs in other industries within the US. It has also blocked Chinese solar panels and some medicines too. Japanese newspapers reported last week that China will no longer be shipping rare earth elements to Japan because of Japan's support for the renegade province of Taiwan. But Professor Richard Wolff also knows that it is because China is trying to secure its share in the global economy, a share that was previously allocated poorly due to colonialism. It seeks to operate in an economy that caters to the whims. It does not seek to operate in an economy that caters to the whims of the West only, which means that China was well within its rights to stop any exports of these very rare earth elements to the US. Japan therefore became the US's likely go-between, uh, be, uh, became the West's likely middleman. And once this was found out, China promptly cut the supplies off. This this also ties back into what Iran does. As he explained, Iran currently is trying to secure its share in the global oil trade. Previously, it did so through nationalization. This led to the 1953 coup d'etat, Operations Ajax and Boot, in other words, which in the end precipitated the Iranian Revolution, the same force that continues to resist the US not only in Iran itself but throughout the axis of resistance, and has formed a key and itself has formed a key aspect of BRICS and the SCO. And meanwhile, as all of this goes down, there was a recent article that came out that hints at similar Saudi ambitions. Professor Michael Hudson explained that a Saudi article published by the House of Saud stated that President Richard Nixon asserted that the US had to invade Saudi Arabia in 1973 because it was leading the Arab oil embargo. The UK talked him out of it, warning that Saudi Arabia would then turn against the US along with other Arab states. On March 3rd, 2026, during the Second Imposed War, President Mohammed bin Salman forbade the US military from using Saudi airspace. He convinced Kuwait to do the same, which is why Operation Freedom died and why Iran did not attack Saudi Arabia and Kuwait as extensively as the UAE. This is this is quite poignant. This is quite important information that was previously unknown to the rest of the world. The article goes on to highlight how both incidents spell disaster for Saudi Arabia and the Arab world. It also blames Israel as the key destabilizing force in Southwest Asia. To soften the blow, Saudi Arabia pledged to buy $142 billion worth of US weaponry, the largest arms purchase in US history. But it confirms that the US does not have the productivity to meet these demands for years. It concludes by reiterating President Mohammed bin Salman's statement that US bases in Saudi Arabia are a threat to Saudi security. Saudi Arabia will not fight to the last Saudi for US interests, unlike Ukraine. Bold words. We will see just what the Saudi royal family itself thinks. As many as many may suspect, families are not monoliths. Royal families even more so, and royal families that control entire countries who themselves have very vying in who themselves are vying for various avenues of influence even more so. We shall see whether President Mohammed bin Salman eventually reaches critical mass and what he aims to do with that mass. But meanwhile, there is also an but meanwhile, I would like to go back to what to what was stated about unproductivity, about the West's unproductive economy and colonialism. President, Professor Michael explains that the second imposed war will clear out the vestigial remains of European and American colonialism, and it will also stop the US from monopolizing the international oil and naval trade. The big question remains, what do other countries want? Do they want to support free trade in oil, or do they want to support an American monopoly in the oil trade? So far, they have not thought this through, leaving them vulnerable to US corporations that have patents in leading and necessary technologies. And as for the EU, he explains that it cannot act as a financial empire like the US because its confiscation of the $300 billion in Russian assets in Euroclear made the euro an unattractive foreign currency. It also blocked China from owning businesses in the EU. And yet, at the NATO summit in Ankara, it enabled the US to own businesses in the EU to manufacture arms, the very same arms that will take years to develop. He asserts that these other countries need to make up their minds. Capitalism failed in many countries, but it succeeded in Russia because it evolved into socialism, or more precise, the mixed economy that Russia continues to foster. China did the same. It fostered tangible investments to boost productivity and not to make money through rents and patent holds and withholding patents. But in the West, the spirit of industrial capitalism is being destroyed thanks to neoliberalism and financialization. Russia and China pose an alternative to post-industrial capitalism and imperialism. The global south needs to decide what kind of economy it wants to operate and on whose benefit. And I will give an important example. Pepe Escobar recently explained that India has not escaped its own century of humiliation under the British Raj. Its oligarchy continues to foster an inferiority complex that forces it to follow Western standards of economic development. An Indian friend of his confirmed that this was an error that the Indian government made and is unwilling to recognize and therefore correct. This has disastrous implications for BRICS, and he has little hope that India can offer anything substantial during the BRICS summit. India, excuse me, Pepe reiterates that India has no credibility with other BRICS members due to its recent actions. How Iran will be received at the upcoming BRICS summit is key. Iran and China, of course, will be doing their legwork in getting the UAE on the same page with Iran, given that they are both BRICS member states. He also states that Russia, China, and Iran are all in favor of Pakistan joining BRICS, something that I had yeah, are in favor of joining BRICS. But as I had predicted before, India will arrest any attempts for Pakistani membership despite its newfound diplomatic clout. He did make similar cases about Brazil in its BRICS at its BRICS summit in 2025. And whilst he was somewhat correct, Brazil did surprise him. It was still true that no new ground was covered at that summit. The last BRICS summit where serious ground was covered was at Kazan in Russia in 2024. If India hopes to even meet that standard, it will really have to pull the stops, and it has only a few months to do so. It will have to get its act together on the question of Pakistan, given that it will have to get its act together on the question of Pakistan and on the question of its own policies. Essentially, India will have to do what India and Turkey will both have to do the one thing they do not want to do but will be compelled to. They will be forced to choose a side. They will be forced to choose the West at the exclusion of Eurasia or Eurasia at the exclusion of the West. I wish to reiterate that this is not Russia or China's intention. It is the US that is imposing this choice. It is the US that is imposing its system, its currency, its way of economics, and even its culture. And if any country that goes on its own path, like Iran had done, they will gang up on it. They will seek to destroy its government. They will seek to overthrow it and to tar its reputation. And if that does not work, it will seek to embroil it in a civil war until that country finally fails, as was the case in Syria and Libya. We will see what India has in store. I myself am with Pepe. There is not much that could be done. And unlike with Brazil, where President Luiz de Silva at least had the gall to stand up to the US, even if had the gall to stand up against the US, he was doing so alone. In India, there is nobody in government who would be doing so. The BJP historically has always been pro-US, so one should not expect any serious changes. And if they are, it will be due to public pressure and not due to the Indian government's innovations. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to seeing your comments and questions. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.